Hey, everybody, as we start to round out developing our performance plate, one of the other big nutrients that's going to be really important to try to include into your diet is going to be specifically dairy. Now, you can see on here, there's a couple different examples. And when I talk about dairy, it could be things like milk, cheeses, cottage cheese, alternative milks. Um, Now, when we're looking at why is milk or why is dairy specifically important? Dairy is going to provide us some really key nutrients. One being vitamin D. Vitamin D is important for developing and building strong bones. With vitamin D, you also need calcium to do that, and also vitamin K and magnesium. The two big ones you're going to get from dairy is vitamin D and calcium specifically. Vitamin D is also going to be very important with helping with your immune system too, right? If we're looking at it from an athlete's perspective, we want to try to reinforce that immune system as much as possible. You're going to have a lot of physical stress on your body. You're going to be training. Most athletes at times can train anywhere between 30 minutes a day, who knows, up to sometimes 4 to 5 hours a day, depending on if they do two training sessions in a row, one in the morning, one in the evening. Depending on the sport, if you have multiple games or multiple matches in a row that day, that might take up anywhere between 45 minutes to 2 hours. So we want to try to provide our body with the necessary nutrients every single day to help reinforce that immune system, so that way it has the defenses to hopefully reduce our risk of getting sick. And again, also reducing our risk of possibly getting injured. We can never get rid of stress. We can never, totally get rid of injuries. But the best thing we could do is try to provide our body with what it needs to hopefully reduce a lot of those things from consistently occurring. So probably one big question you're going to ask is, okay, well, what's the difference between a plant-based alternative dairy option and a milk-based dairy option? A lot of times with athletes, you run into issues with lactose intolerance. And in those situations, right, it can really depend on the level of lactose intolerance. You could have athletes that can't have any milk at all, right? It doesn't matter what food it is. If it has milk ingredients, right, they get nauseous, they get sick, they get upset stomach. And then all of a sudden, they may have to start switching over to an alternative dairy source because dairy doesn't agree with their stomachs. And they're actually getting physical symptoms that's making them sick, which then again is affecting them physically because it may be impairing their performance, their ability to train. And again, if you're feeling like you're sick and nauseous and you don't feel good, that only doesn't affect you physically, that also is going to affect you mentally, because you're thinking about how your body's feeling and you're not able to put 100% of your focus and concentration on the task that's at hand in front of you. Now, there are some athletes with mild lactose intolerance, right? So they may be able to handle yogurts or cottage cheeses, yogurts especially because they have probiotics. These are actual bacteria that are in the yogurt. You can also get these from things like kimchi, kombucha. These help to provide the body with good gut bacteria. 70% of our immune system lies in our gut. So again, like I said before, we want to help to continue to reinforce and provide the gut with the necessary probiotics, which are the actual active bacteria, and prebiotics, which we can get made from the foods that we eat and digest. So, for example, things that are high in fiber, like your fruits, your vegetables, your whole grains, they typically have fiber, which can have essentially be a prebiotic and be developed into those good gut bacteria by breaking them down in the gut. Now, usually your animal-based or dairy sources, the nutrients in there are going to be a lot more absorbable in comparison to a plant-based or a alternative milk. And a lot of your alternative milks also typically lack a significant amount of protein. I would say the only one that's going to be comparable is probably a soy milk, which is going to probably have a similar amount of protein as a regular cow's milk. But a lot of the other ones, your almond milk, your rice milk, your oat milk, apparently they can milk everything nowadays, but those aren't going to really have maybe 1 or 2 grams of protein unless that company or that alternative milk option actually adds protein back into it. Now, not only, you heard me mention a couple other nutrients there, right? The other huge benefit of intaking dairy, right, is you're getting vitamin D, you're getting calcium, right? You're also going to get carbohydrates, which are important for fuel and energy. They're a really good protein source, so helping to repair, recover the body, the muscles. is going to be an important factor there. And they're going to have some of those electrolytes like a potassium, maybe a little bit of sodium in there, depending if it's a cheese, for example. So these can really be a really good bang for your buck, especially because they have, a large mixture of different macronutrients, vitamins, minerals that the athlete's going to need to eat, not only at a meal, but definitely throughout their day as they're, fueling and preparing for the training, but also really good to use directly after the training to help recover from it, right? The two most important things that we need after some type of activity or training, we need to rehydrate from what we sweated out. We need to get in fuel because if you think about your body as a car, right? If your fuel gauge is starting to run low, and if you look at training, right? If you've trained 2 hours, your energy is going to start to go down. You're going to start to get tired. So if you don't refill your car, which is your body, right? And then you have to go and train another time in the afternoon. You got to go train the next day, and your fuel gauge is only at half and not even any close to full, right? The output or the ability you're going to be able to put into that specific training session, you're not going to be able to maximize and get the most out of it. And then 3, right? The protein's helping to recover. When you train, you're physically breaking down your body, you're breaking down the muscle tissue, and we need to provide that protein not only at one meal or one snack, but evenly throughout the day. So that way we're recovering not just part of the day, we're recovering that whole entire part of your day. Now, going back to some of your examples, right? Yogurt cups, especially Greek yogurt, your Greek yogurt is going to be higher in protein than your regular yogurt. When you're also looking at a lot of your yogurts, right? Anytime you have things that has a lot of syrups, and sometimes depending on the yogurt, the type of added fruit they put into there, you got to be very careful because yogurt can get really high in added sugars really quickly. So when you're looking in the back of that yogurt cup or that big yogurt container, right, one thing you can do if you want to try to avoid getting a lot of excess added sugars is getting plain yogurt, add your own fruit, add a little bit of honey, maybe some granola, boom, you made a parfait. It's still going to be sweet because you add some fresh fruit in there. Or try to get the yogurts that don't have 30, 40, 50 grams of sugar in them. If you're looking at the back of the label, if it has anywhere between 5 to 15, that's a reasonable amount. Anything going over that tends to be a little bit in excess. It's just like when you're shopping for cereal, right? If the first ingredient on the back of the label in the cereal says sugar, or if per serving it has, again, like 25 to 50 grams of sugar, probably going to have to be not going to be the highest quality option, or in that case, the highest quality cereal you could specifically choose. So that's just some quick and easy tips specifically about dairy. Now, again, there is all these alternative dairy options out there, right? A lot of these are fortified with vitamin D and calcium. It still provides at least an alternative option for those athletes that maybe can't have a lot of dairy consumption because they might have a mild lactose intolerance or an actually full-blown lactose intolerance issue. So it is good that we have these other options. Because where the other challenging thing really comes into is if you look at vitamin D specifically, the main source is going to be dairy, being out in the sun, and then you have a couple other small options, right? You might be able to get it from some different fatty fishes, maybe like a tuna or a salmon. You might get a little bit in some mushrooms, right? But the amount of options that you can get vitamin D from are pretty limited. Okay, you could also get a little bit in, if you have a fortified orange juice, if you have a fortified cereals. But again, if you look at that, right, if you count on your hand, that's not very many options. So if you're an athlete that has a lactose intolerance, if you're an indoor athlete and you're not out in the sun on a regular basis, right? If you look at specifically like basketball, for instance, right? Typically, African Americans are at a higher chance for lactose intolerance too. And then there's other different confounding factors that can kind of come into play, right? But if you're 3 or 4 of those factors, right? Well, now you're not getting enough vitamin D. If you're not getting a vitamin D, your vitamin D level could possibly be low, right? If your vitamin D level is low, now we're putting you as an athlete at a high risk for possibly getting sick more, at a high risk for probably getting injured. And then two, right, if you're also an athlete, especially in the high school setting, that's still growing and developing, and you're not getting enough vitamin D and it's really low, right, you're also probably going to be possibly at a higher risk for breaking or fracturing something. Again, if you look at those three things, injury, breaking and fracturing, sickness, still trying to grow and develop, right? Three of those, if those happen to you, that's going to impact directly like what if you're going to be even available to be on the court, the field, whatever playing field that you're on, that's going to affect whether you can practice or not, whether you can compete or not, whether you can lift or not, right? And if you can't do those things, that's impacting you being able to get tape, you being able to let colleges and people see what you're able to do, right? So you can see, right, sometimes nutrition gets pushed to the side, but if you're not taking care of your body and you're not putting the right nutrients in, it can have a direct impact on what you're going to do on a daily basis in whatever sport that you're going to be in. So I highly recommend, right, if you're not eating regular dairy, get an alternative, get outside, get some sunshine, right, at least 30, 60 minutes a day. And the last thing I'm going to throw in there are two, I've heard this on several different podcasts, whether it's with dietitians, people with their doctorate in research. You also have to take into part where you live in the world and where you live, let's say in the US specifically, right? I used to live in New York, and in New York, 6 months out of the year, dark, gloomy. Sometimes you don't get any sunshine for weeks, right? So seasonal depression can kick in. And then also now you're really not getting a lot of sunlight, even if you are outside for 30, 60, 90 minutes or more during those times of year. Where your state lands in the country, right, will also depend on how much sun exposure you get. If you're closer to the equator and you're closer to those regions where there's going to be typically more sunlight, a higher amount of sun exposure in some of those states, like you say for Florida, for instance, it might be a little bit easier to get the amount of vitamin D you need from the sun on a daily basis. But if you're someone who's up north, farther away from the equator, right, you may get sun those other times of year, like the summertime, but the sun you may be getting may not be as effective as the sun that's in different parts of the country, or again, closer to the equator, for example, where the sun exposure or the strength of the sun in that area may be stronger, which may allow you to get more vitamin D from that aspect. So there's a lot of different factors to think about. Again, keep it simple at the end of the day. Try to get at least 2 to 4 servings, or at least a couple of those options in a smoothie, on your plate at a meal. Mix it in with a snack, at least a few times a day. Just because as an athlete, like your need for it is going to be a lot higher than typically the general population or the general public. If you can't eat dairy, get on an alternative right away, or try to include those other options that are really high in vitamin D on a daily or every other day basis. And again, the last thing, I know I said this a couple of times, but the last thing I'm going to include is I would really advise people to try to get blood work done, right? Because there is still some athletes that are taking in lots of dairy, but may not have sufficient vitamin D levels, and may still be at risk, because you may just not get enough, even through the overall consumption of food that you're taking in on a daily or regular basis. So I think I'm really into blood work. I think getting blood work is huge. At least I would say I'd recommend 3 to 4 times a year, right? Because I'd rather you get blood work before the season, during the season, after the season, or at least every 3 months if possible. Because if you're not getting blood work, right, you're just guessing, right? You're just hoping, if you took a supplement, if you eat enough dairy, you're hoping your levels are normal. But if you're not testing, you're never going to know if your levels are normal or not. So if you're testing frequently and you know where your levels are at, right, and you are eating a lot of dairy, then it may come into a situation where, regardless of how much dairy you're taking in, you may be an individual that has to supplement with a certain nutrient. And possibly in this case, you may have to supplement with vitamin D regardless, because no matter how much dairy you intake or alternative dairy you intake, it still may not be enough for what your specific body needs. And again, I say for your specific body because everybody individually is different. For me to make a recommendation or tell everyone to do the exact same cookie cutter thing is not the approach you want to take. That's why get blood tested, see what your levels are, and then you could take more of a better approach with how you're going to fuel, eat, or if there's supplementation that has to come into play, what you need to do there. Now, talking about supplementation, right? 90% of the, and I'll have a whole thing I'll talk about supplements specifically, so I'll just briefly touch on it. But make sure if you're taking supplementation, work with a sports dietitian. Okay. Add the NSF for Sport app, add the Inform Choice app. This way, you're taking a high quality option. It's been tested. It hopefully doesn't have any of the banned substances, illegal substances. It has the right labeling. It has the right amount in it. Again, if you're in college, if you're in the pros, even if you're in high school about to transition to college, right? You don't want to run the risk of taking something that could possibly negatively affect your health in a big way. So make sure you're doing the necessary things to protect yourself and actually taking a product that's going to help and work, rather than just taking something that some random Joe Schmo recommended or something you saw on social media on TikTok or Instagram. Again, a lot of the stuff on social media, 90% of it is a bunch of garbage, right? So if you're going to follow someone on social media, make sure if it's nutrition, they are an actual licensed or registered dietitian that is obviously credible in the field, has the degrees in place, has the credentials in place. And you're probably going to know pretty quickly who's going to be the higher level professional, knows what they're talking about, is putting out high quality information, versus the people that are just putting out information to get clicks and views because they want to sell something to you for you to buy it, which is not my intention with this, right? I'm not making any money on this right now. I'm just educating people because I want, not only those who I work with to get better, but I want others to get better that are around me, whether it's practitioners or hopefully this is athletes watching these videos. They can take something from this, add it to their toolbox. They get better. That helps them as an athlete in their performance. And now they just got better. And that's kind of my overall goal with doing these videos. Went on a little bit of a soapbox rant, but I hope this slide specifically on dairy products was beneficial and helped.